At 18, Leo had already lost the only man who ever saw him true, been framed for a crime he did not commit, and been cast out from the single place he had ever called a home. All his former life left him with was a junked school bus on a forgotten patch of land beside the marsh, the title transferred for the insulting and legally binding sum of $1, and the whole town whispered about the thief hiding in the weeds. They laughed. But what nobody knew, what the polished man who ruined him could never guess, was that the old bus was not empty. It held a promise, a life's work sealed away from the world. That, though, comes later. First, there was the end of things. It had come on a Tuesday, the sky over the water the color of a bruised plum, the air tasting of salt and impending winter. Silas was gone. One moment he was there, a solid shape in the dim light of the boatyard, his hands smelling of pine tar and patience. The next he was a story people told. A heart that had beaten time with the tides for 73 years had simply stopped. For Leo, it was not merely a stopped heart. It was the silencing of the world's one steady engine. Silas had taken him in when he was 14, a boy brittle with neglect, and had not asked for a history. He had just handed him a block of soft wood and a carving knife and said, "Make it look like something you'd want to hold." Leo had been at the yard ever since, sleeping in the small room above the office, learning the language of wood, of sealant, of engines that had given up and could be coaxed back to life. He learned that a thing's not done until it's done right, a phrase Silas repeated like a prayer. Then Silas was gone, and the boatyard, the only solid ground Leo had ever known, was sold. The new man was named Carver. He arrived in a car that shone even under the gray sky, his shoes never touching the dirt path if he could help it, his smile a clean, sharp line that did not reach his eyes. Carver saw the yard not as a living history, but as an asset. He walked through the workshops, his gaze cataloging everything for its price, not its purpose. He looked at Leo, the quiet boy in grease-stained jeans, and saw a liability. He saw the old, three-legged stray dog that had been Silas's shadow and saw a nuisance. He saw the rusted yellow school bus sinking into the mud at the edge of the property and saw scrap. A week after the papers were signed, Carver made his move. A client, a rich man with a yacht named the Wanderer, reported a set of antique brass portholes and binnacle missing. They were worth a fortune. Carver called the sheriff, his face a mask of grave concern. He let his gaze drift toward Leo, who was quietly sanding a damaged tiller. He mentioned how the boy had been quiet lately, withdrawn. He mentioned how Leo knew every corner of the yard, every lock. He did not have to say the word thief. The sheriff, a man who respected money and clean shoes, heard it anyway. They found a single brass cleat, small and unimportant, under the mattress in Leo's small room. Leo had never seen it before. It was not from the Wanderer. It did not matter. The story was set. Carver was magnanimous in his victory. He wouldn't press charges, he told the sheriff, not if the boy was gone by morning. Just gone. Disappeared. It was a kindness, he framed it, for Silas's sake. The last person Leo spoke to at the yard was Dale, a man who had worked alongside Silas for 20 years, his face a map of sun and worry. Dale stood by the gate, his hands jammed in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the gravel. He wouldn't look at Leo. "Heard you're leaving," Dale mumbled. Leo just nodded, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He wanted to scream, to ask Dale why. Why he'd said nothing when Carver was spinning his lies. Why he'd let this happen. But the words were frozen. He was used to making himself small, to swallowing the things that burned. Dale finally looked up, his eyes watery and weak. "It's for the best," he said, the words thin and useless. He was a man drowning in fear, afraid of losing his job, his place. He had chosen the boat over the boy. Leo turned and walked away, the gate clicking shut behind him like the closing of a lock on a cell. He had a backpack with a change of clothes, a worn copy of a book Silas had given him, and a folded piece of paper in his pocket. It was the title to the bus. Silas had signed it over to him a year before, laughing. "Every man needs a piece of land," Silas had said, tapping the document. "Even if it's just big enough for a bus and a dog. $1, legal and binding." It had been a joke, a piece of whimsy. Now it was the only thing he owned in the world. He walked the 2 miles out of town, past the houses with their warm-lit windows, each one a silent accusation. The road curved toward the marsh, the air growing colder, wetter. He could smell the decay, the sweet, earthy rot of the wetlands. And then he saw it. The yellow was faded to the color of old butter, streaked with rust that looked like dried blood. The windows were clouded with grime, one of them shattered in a spiderweb pattern. The tires were flat, sunk deep into the soft earth. It did not look like a shelter. It looked like a tomb. As he approached, a shape detached itself from the shadows beneath the bus. It was the dog. Silas's old 3-legged stray. He was gaunt, his coat matted, but his one good eye was clear. He watched Leo approach, gave a single, tentative thump of his tail, and then laid his head back down on his paws, as if to say, "I've been waiting." Leo stopped in front of the groaning double doors of the bus. He pulled the creaking handle. The doors folded open with a sound like a gasp. The air that rolled out was stale, smelling of mildew and mice and thyme. He stepped up, his footfalls echoing in the metal tube. The seats were ripped, the green vinyl split open like wounds, spilling yellowed foam. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light slanting through the dirty windows. It was worse than he could have imagined. This was not a home, it was an ending. He walked the length of the aisle, his hand trailing over the cold metal of the seat backs. He reached the last bench seat at the very back. He sat down, the springs sighing under his weight. The backpack slid from his shoulder to the floor. Outside, the dog whined softly. Leo put his head in his hands, the cold of the bus seeping into his bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He was 18 years old. He was alone, and winter was coming. The first week was a study in misery. The cold was a physical presence, a thing that crept in through the cracked windows and the rusted floor panels and never left. Leo stuffed the broken window with his spare shirt. He used old newspapers he found under a seat to plug the worst of the drafts. It helped, but only a little. Sleep came in ragged snatches, a shivering surrender to exhaustion. He woke each morning with his breath pluming in the air, the metal walls slick with a frost that grew on the inside. He had $43. He spent 6 of it on a thick blanket and a box of crackers at the town's general store, enduring the sideways glances and the sudden silences that fell when he walked down the aisle. The rest he hoarded, counting it each night, the worn bills a flimsy shield against a future he could not bear to imagine. The dog, whom he had started calling Tripod, was his only constant. The animal was a silent, loyal companion, sleeping curled against the outside of the bus door, a furry guardian against the vast, empty dark. Leo shared his crackers, and in return, the dog brought him things. A dead squirrel once, laid carefully on the steps. Another time, a half-frozen apple, probably dropped from a passing truck. They were a pack of 2, bonded by a shared abandonment. On the 5th day, another visitor appeared. A battered pickup truck rattled to a stop on the dirt track near the bus. An old woman got out. It was Agnes, who ran the town's small diner, a place of worn linoleum and coffee that was always on. She was a woman built of strong opinions and sturdy shoes, her face a roadmap of 70-odd years. She carried a thermos and a paper bag. She did not waste time with pleasantries. "Silas would be ashamed of this town," she said, her voice gravelly. She handed him the bag. Inside was a thick sandwich and 2 apples. She unscrewed the cap on the thermos and poured steaming soup into the cup. It smelled of chicken and thyme and a warmth Leo had forgotten existed. He drank it, the heat spreading through his chest, and he felt a stinging in his eyes he refused to acknowledge. "Heard what Carver said," Agnes continued, looking at the bus, her lips pursed in disapproval. "Man's a snake in a nice suit. Some people measure a life in dollars. Others measure it in what they leave fixed. Silas was a fixer. She stayed for an hour, talking about Silas. She told Leo stories he had never heard, of how Silas had once rebuilt the engine on the town's only fire truck for free, working 3 nights straight. Of how he quietly paid the grocery bill for the miller's family all winter after the mill had a bad year. He never said a word about it. "He kept things," Agnes said, her gaze distant. "Not in a hoarding way, in a this might be useful to someone someday way. Hated to see anything good go to waste." As she was leaving, she pressed a small, heavy box into his hands. "Found these in the back of the diner. From my husband. He's been gone 10 years. They're no use to me." Inside were heavy wool socks, a pair of leather work gloves, and a small cast-iron wood stove, no bigger than a shoebox, designed for an ice fishing shanty. It was rusted, but solid. "You're a clever boy," she said. "Silas always said you saw with your hands. Figure it out." She drove away, leaving Leo standing in the cold, the weight of the small stove in his hands feeling like an anchor. The stove changed everything. It took Leo 2 days to get it working. He needed a flue, a way to get the smoke out. He found a length of old metal pipe in a ditch by the road. He used the heel of his boot and a rock to flatten one end, shaping it into a flange he could fit against the bus's metal skin. He needed to cut a hole. He had no tools, save for the carving knife Silas had given him. He spent an entire afternoon meticulously scoring a circle into the roof of the bus with the tip of the blade, over and over, hundreds of times, his arm aching, his determination a cold fire. He worked until the groove was deep enough that he could punch the metal out with the rock. It was a ragged, ugly hole, but it was a hole. He fitted the pipe, sealing the edges with mud from the marsh, which he knew would bake hard as brick. He gathered driftwood from the water's edge, wood that was seasoned by salt and sun. He lit the first fire with a book of matches from Agnes's sandwich bag and a page torn from the back of his book. The small stove glowed a dull cherry red, and for the first time in weeks, a wave of dry heat pushed back the damp, biting cold. Tripod, who had been watching the entire process with intense curiosity, crept inside and lay down as close to the stove as he could get, his body finally uncoiling from its tight, shivering knot. A fragile domesticity began to take root in the metal shell. The days took on a shape. Morning was for gathering wood. The afternoon was for reinforcing the bus against the weather. Using scraps of tin and tar paper, he scrounged from an abandoned shed a mile down the road. The evenings were for sitting by the fire, reading the same book over and over, sharing his meager meals with the dog, the silence broken only by the crackle of the flames and the sigh of the wind. The bus was no longer just a shell. It was a den, a cave, a fortress against the world that had cast him out. It was in this state of slow, meticulous survival that he began to truly see the bus. Not as a vehicle, but as a construction. His hands, now protected by the leather gloves, were always moving, always testing surfaces, running along seams, learning the architecture of his strange new home. And that is when he noticed the anomaly. It was the panel at the very back, the one that formed the wall behind the last bench seat. It was a flat sheet of metal, just like the others. But something was wrong. Silas had taught him to look for the story in a thing, the marks of its making and its mending. The rivets on this panel were different from the ones on the sides. They were not the factory standard, machine-pressed rivets. These were smaller, hand-hammered, their edges slightly uneven. A craftsman's work, not a machine's. He ran his gloved hand over the panel. It felt solid, but when he knocked on it, the sound was wrong. The other walls of the bus had a dull, solid thud. This one had a faint resonance, a hollow echo that was quickly dampened. It sounded like there was a space behind it. But there was no space. Behind that wall should be the engine compartment, a tangle of machinery and steel. He went outside, circling to the back of the bus. He lifted the heavy engine cover. The massive diesel block sat there, coated in grease and grime, exactly as it should be. There was no gap, no hidden compartment visible from the outside. Yet the sound persisted. It became an obsession, a splinter in his mind. During the day, he would work, his mind calm and focused on the task at hand. But at night, sitting in the quiet, fire-lit dark, his eyes would be drawn to that back wall. He would run his fingers over the line of strange rivets, tracing their pattern. Why were they there? Why would someone replace a single interior panel on a junked school bus with such care? It made no sense. Unless the panel wasn't a repair. Unless it was a door. The idea of a door took hold and would not let go. It was a foolish thought, a fantasy born of loneliness and cold. But it was there, a persistent whisper. He had to know. He needed tools, real tools. His carving knife was good for small, precise work, but it was no match for hammered rivets. He remembered Agnes's words. Silas kept things. The boatyard was a fortress now, guarded by Carver's suspicion. But the old dump, the town's landfill, was a mile in the other direction. Silas had called it the Library of Lost Things. He had taken Leo there once or twice, looking for a specific hinge or a piece of brass that couldn't be bought anymore. You just have to know how to read the shelves, he'd said, gesturing to the heaps of refuse. For 3 days, Leo walked to the dump at dawn and spent hours sifting through the debris. He found a rusted crowbar, a hammer with a cracked handle he could reinforce with wire, and a cold chisel that was pitted but still had an edge. They were junk, but to Leo, they were keys. He waited for a night when the wind was high, a gale that shrieked and moaned around the corners of the bus, a sound that would cover his work. He stoked the fire in the little stove until the inside of the bus was warm and bright. Tripod lay watching him, his head on his paws, a low rumble in his chest. Leo started with the chisel. He placed its tip against the edge of one of the hand-hammered rivets and struck it hard with the hammer. The clang of metal on metal was shocking, even with the wind. He flinched, waiting for a shout, for headlights to sweep across the windows. Nothing, just the wind. He struck it again and again. A rhythm began. Strike, turn, strike. It was slow, brutal work. The rivet was stubborn. It had been set by a man who meant it to hold. An hour passed, and he had only managed to mangle the head of a single rivet. Sweat ran down his back despite the cold. His arms ached. He was about to give up, to dismiss it as a mad fancy, when he remembered something else Silas had told him, while they were trying to free a frozen bolt on an old keel. "Don't fight it, son," Silas had said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Persuade it. Find its weakness." Leo stopped hammering. He looked closely at the rivet, at the way the metal was seated. He wasn't trying to break the rivet itself, he was trying to remove it. He switched tools. He used the sharp end of the crowbar, wedging it carefully under the lip of the panel, right next to the rivet he had been abusing. He put all his weight on it. The metal groaned, a high, protesting shriek. He pushed harder, his muscles straining. And then, with a sound like a gunshot, the rivet head popped off and shot across the bus, ricocheting off the far wall. His ears rang. Tripod jumped to his feet, barking. Leo stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had done it. The panel had moved, only a fraction of an inch, but it had moved. A dark line had appeared where metal had been sealed to metal. A surge of adrenaline, of pure, unadulterated certainty, flooded through him. It was a door. It was real. The rest of the rivets came easier. Now that he knew the trick, he worked with a focused intensity, using the crowbar to apply pressure while he weakened the heads with the chisel. Each pop was a victory, a word in a sentence he was finally able to read. It took him another 2 hours. Finally, only one rivet remained at each corner. He wedged the crowbar into the gap he had created and pulled. The entire panel bowed outward, groaning as the last of the seals broke. It was hinged, not on the side, but at the bottom, with two massive, silent hinges he hadn't been able to see. The panel swung down slowly, like a drawbridge, and came to rest on the floor of the bus with a solid, definitive thud. Leo stared, his breath caught in his throat. The space behind it was dark. Not the greasy, mechanical dark of an engine compartment. This was a clean, still darkness, a deliberate emptiness. It smelled not of oil or diesel, but of something else entirely. It smelled of cedar, of varnish, and of time held perfectly still. He reached into his pocket for the book of matches. His hands were shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to strike one. The small flame flared to life, casting a flickering, golden light into the opening. And Leo's world fell away. It was not a compartment, it was a room. The entire back third of the bus, the space that should have been filled with the engine and drivetrain, had been hollowed out, walled off, and transformed. The light from his match glinted off dozens of pairs of glass eyes. He was looking into a secret museum. Along both walls, from floor to ceiling, were shelves. And on the shelves, nestled in custom-made cradles, were ships. Model ships. Not the kind from a kit, all plastic and glue. These were made of wood, plank by plank, each one a masterpiece of impossible detail. There were sleek racing yachts with sails made of the finest silk, their rigging as fine as spiderweb. There were sturdy, broad-beamed fishing trawlers, their decks weathered and stained to look like they had spent a lifetime at sea. There were elegant, old-fashioned schooners and humble, single-masted workboats. Each one was perfect, each one was a world unto itself. Leo took a step forward, crossing the threshold from the cold, rusted bus into this hidden sanctuary. The floor here was solid wood, polished and clean. A small, built-in workbench sat against the far wall, a miniature vise attached to its edge. Tiny, specialized tools, chisels the size of a needle, saws with teeth so fine they were barely visible, were arranged in a neat leather roll on the wall above it. This was not a hobby. This was a life. He lit another match, and another, the small bursts of light revealing more and more detail. On the deck of a tiny trawler, there was a coil of rope no thicker than a thread, perfectly laid. On a model of a grand passenger ship, he could see the individual panes of glass in the windows of the grand salon. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the hull of a small, unpainted sailboat. The wood was smooth as silk, the curves so fair and perfect they seemed to have been shaped by water itself. It was Silas's work. It had to be. The quiet man who fixed engines and patched hulls, the man who everyone thought was just a simple boatyard owner, had been a master. A secret artist of the highest order. This was what he did when the world was asleep. He came here, to this hidden room inside a junked bus, and he built worlds. Leo sank to his knees on the wooden floor, the spent matches falling from his numb fingers. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the secret washed over him. The years of patience. The thousands of hours of silent, meticulous work. The love. Every single boat on these shelves, he realized, was a boat he had seen in the yard. The Wanderer was there, its brass portholes gleaming. The old fishing boat, the Sea Serpent, which had sunk in a storm and Silas had spent a whole winter raising and rebuilding, was there, perfect in miniature. This wasn't just a collection, it was a record, a testament. It was Silas's true ledger, written not in ink, but in wood and brass and string. He thought of Carver, with his shiny shoes and his talk of assets and scrap value. He thought of the whispers in town, of the shame that had been clinging to him like frost. They thought this bus was a piece of trash. They thought he was a thief hiding in the garbage. They had no idea at all. He sat there in the dark and the silence for a long time, surrounded by the fleet of ghost ships. He was no longer in a tomb. He was in a cathedral, and he was not an outcast. He was a guardian. The cold was gone. The hunger was gone. The fear was gone. All that was left was the profound, earth-shaking weight of the discovery and a single, burning question. Why? Why hide all this? Why here? He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the answer was here, somewhere in this room, waiting for him. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a little longer, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. For a week, Leo lived a double life. To the outside world, he was still the boy in the junked bus, a pariah subsisting on scraps. But inside, he was the curator of a hidden world. He spent his days securing his fortress, gathering wood, making the bus itself more livable, a mundane reality that protected the miracle within. But when night fell and the world outside was lost to darkness and wind, he would swing down the heavy panel door and step into Silas's workshop. He did not turn on a light. There was no electricity, but he found a box of thick tallow candles on one of the shelves, the kind that burned slow and steady. He would light one and place it on the workbench, and the room would fill with a soft, warm glow. The light made the wooden hulls gleam like polished chestnuts. It caught the fine lines of the rigging, making them shimmer like silver threads. Tripod would come and lie just inside the threshold, his chin on the wooden floor, watching Leo with his one wise eye, as if he had known about this place all along. Leo began to study the ships, one by one. He would take them down from their cradles with an almost religious reverence. His hands, which had been raw and chapped from the cold and the rough work, became gentle. He held the small vessels and saw not just the craft, but the story. He recognized the specific patch on the hull of the Anime, a fishing boat owned by a man who had 6 children and no money for a proper repair. Silas had fixed it for a bushel of clams. He saw the new mast on the Swift, a racing boat that had been dismasted in a squall. Silas had shaped the new mast himself from a piece of spruce he had been saving for 20 years. It was all here, a lifetime of quiet service, of uncredited acts of grace, each one memorialized in perfect, miniature form. He learned to read the room. The ships on the top shelves were the old ones, their varnish darkened with age. These were the boats of Silas's youth, vessels long gone from the harbor, now existing only here, in this time capsule. The ones on the lower shelves were more recent, boats Leo himself had worked on. Seeing them, he felt a strange connection, a sense that he had been a part of this secret story without even knowing it. He found a small logbook tucked away on the workbench, its leather cover soft with age. But it wasn't the record he was expecting. It was a technical journal. Page after page of Silas's neat, blocky handwriting detailed the properties of different woods, the formulas for mixing his own varnishes, the geometry of hull design. It was the work of a scholar, a scientist of the craft. There were no names, no dates, no mention of why he built the models. It was a book about the work, for the work's sake. And in its own way, that was the most profound explanation of all. The work was the point. It wasn't for praise, or for money, or for fame. It was for the quiet satisfaction of making a thing right. As the days passed, a change began to settle in Leo. The shame that had been a cold weight in his gut began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. He was not just hiding, he was protecting something. This secret was not his to own, but it was his to defend. He began to clean the workshop, gently dusting the shelves, sweeping the floor. He felt like a monk tending a sacred scriptorium. He was no longer just a boy in a bus, he was the keeper of the flame. The fragile peace of his secret world was shattered on a bitter morning in early December. A heavy snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the marsh in a pristine, silent white. The world seemed muffled and still. Leo was outside, splitting a piece of driftwood, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound, when Tripod suddenly stood up, a low growl starting in his chest. A moment later, Leo heard it too, the crunch of tires on the snow-covered track. It was a sleek, black SUV, the kind of vehicle that looked alien in this landscape of cattails and scrub pine. It rolled to a stop, its engine a low, arrogant purr. The driver's side door opened, and Carver stepped out. He was wearing a long wool coat and expensive leather boots, but he still looked cold, out of place. He looked at Leo, then at the bus, a faint sneer on his lips. The wisp of smoke curling from the makeshift chimney had given him away. "Well, well," Carver said, his voice thin in the cold air. "Look what the tide dragged in. I thought I told you to be gone." Leo said nothing. He just stood there, the axe held loosely in his hand, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. "I have to admire your resourcefulness," Carver continued, taking a step closer, his gaze sweeping over the bus with open contempt. "Living in a scrap heap, it suits you. But your tenancy is over." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, an official-looking document. "This is an eviction notice. This quarter-acre is part of the boatyard property. I'm expanding, putting in some high-end storage units, prime location." He held the paper out. Leo didn't take it. Carver's smile tightened. He let the paper drop into the snow at Leo's feet. "The $1 sale you had with the old man won't stand up in court. It was a gift, not a transaction, and it wasn't properly filed. My lawyer assures me of that. You have 30 days to vacate the premises and remove your property." He gestured at the bus. "If it's still here on January 15th, it will be considered abandoned refuse, and I will have it removed and crushed." Crushed. The word hit Leo with a physical force. He saw it in his mind, a clawed machine descending, metal screeching and tearing, the hidden workshop, the fleet of perfect ships, all of it splintering, shattering, turning into a meaningless heap of wood and steel. A wave of cold fury, something he had never felt before, washed through him. It was so strong, it almost buckled his knees. "This land was Silas's," Leo said, his voice low and hoarse. "He gave it to me." Carver laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Silas was a sentimental old fool who didn't know the value of anything. He let this place rot. I'm improving it. It's called progress. You should try it sometime." He looked down at Tripod, who was still growling, his lips curled back from his teeth. "And get rid of that mutt. It's a health hazard." He turned and walked back to his SUV, his boots leaving clean, deep prints in the snow. 30 days, Leo," he called back over his shoulder before getting in. "The clock is ticking." The SUV drove away, its tires spinning for a moment before finding purchase, leaving behind a spray of dirty snow and a profound, ringing silence. Leo stood motionless for a long time, watching the track of the tires until they disappeared. He looked down at the paper in the snow. Then he looked at the bus, at the thin curl of smoke rising from the flue, a fragile signal of life in the vast, cold emptiness. Carver was wrong. Silas wasn't a fool. He knew the value of things. He just measured them on a different scale. And now, Leo knew, it was up to him to prove it. The 30-day deadline was not just a threat. It was a challenge. And he would not let Silas's legacy be crushed. The eviction notice became a calendar, marking the days until a potential desecration. The cold fury that had flared in Leo settled into a hard, dense resolve. He was no longer just surviving. He was preparing for a fight he didn't know how to win. He spent hours in the hidden workshop, not just admiring the models, but searching. He was convinced that Silas, a man of such meticulous foresight, would not have left his life's work so vulnerable. There had to be something else. A message. A final piece of the puzzle. He went over every inch of the workshop. He tapped every plank, checked every drawer in the small workbench. He found spare rigging, tiny blocks and tackles, jars of pigment, but nothing that spoke to him across time. Despair began to creep in, cold and familiar. He was just a boy against a rich man with a lawyer. What could he possibly do? One night, about a week before the deadline, he was sitting on the floor, the candle burning low, looking at the model of the Wanderer, the very yacht whose stolen fittings had been his downfall. It was a magnificent piece, detailed down to the tiny life preservers in their racks. On an impulse, he picked it up. It was heavier than it should have been. He turned it over in his hands. The deck, he noticed, was not a single piece. It was fitted together with the same precision as a fine piece of furniture. He ran his thumbnail along a seam near the stern. It felt different. There was a give to it, almost imperceptible. He pressed harder. A section of the deck, no bigger than his palm, clicked and lifted slightly. It was a hatch. A secret compartment inside a model ship in a secret workshop inside a junked bus. His hands trembled as he lifted the small piece of wood away. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, were two things. The first was a small, leather-bound ledger, much smaller than the technical journal. The second was a sealed envelope, made of thick, creamy paper. On the front, in Silas's familiar blocky script, was a single word: Leo. His heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of his chest. He picked up the envelope. The paper was cool and smooth beneath his fingertips. This was it. A letter from the dead. He broke the wax seal, his hands clumsy. He unfolded the single sheet of paper inside and read. Leo, it began, if you are reading this, then you have found my foolishness. And I am gone. I am not a man for many words, so I will be plain. The boats are yours. They are a record of a life, the good parts anyway. I made them not for glory, but for the quiet of it. For the feeling of making a thing whole and right. I leave them to you because you have good hands and a quiet heart. You see the thing that needs fixing, not the thing that can be sold. That is a rare thing. Do with them what you will, but do not let a man like Carver ever lay his hands on them. A man who only sees the price of things can never understand their worth. A thing's not done until it's done right. Your friend, Silas. Tucked into the fold of the letter was a small, brass key. Leo's vision blurred. He read the letter again, and then a third time, the simple, plain-spoken words a balm on the raw wound of the last few months. Silas had seen him. He had trusted him. It was a gift more precious than the models themselves. He picked up the ledger. It was locked with a small brass lock. The key from the letter fit perfectly. He turned it, and the book fell open. The first page stunned him. It was not a record of boats. It was a record of people. Each page was a name, and under it, a list of debts. But the debts were not money owed to Silas. They were kindnesses Silas had performed. Jed Miller, winter '98. Forgave Bill for engine rebuild on the Sea Cow. Paid his family's grocery tab, November to February. Told him it was a church donation. Agnes, spring 2002. Rebuilt compressor for diner's walk-in cooler. Took payment in coffee for a year. Page after page, it was a secret history of the town's hardships and Silas's silent interventions. It was a ledger of grace. He turned the pages, his breath catching. And then he found the last entry, dated just 2 days before Silas died. The entry was for the Wanderer. It read, removed antique brass fittings, 8 portholes, 1 binnacle, for refinishing. Owner concerned about pitting. Serial numbers logged below. And beneath that, a neat list of numbers. The entry continued. Stored in lower port side compartment, workshop. Told Carver's new manager they were sent out. Man seems slippery. Best to keep them close. Leo's blood ran cold. He looked at the shelves, at the dark space beneath them. He scrambled over, holding his candle. There, hidden in the shadows, was a small, locked door he had never noticed. The same brass key from the letter fit. He opened it. Inside, wrapped in soft oilcloth, were the brass fittings. The ones he had been framed for stealing. They had been here, safe, the entire time. Carver hadn't just framed him. He had sold a duplicate set of fittings on the black market and used Leo to cover the insurance fraud, never knowing Silas had already secured the real ones. The ledger wasn't just a record of kindness. It was a weapon. And the clock was ticking. The morning of January 15th dawned clear and cruelly cold. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the sun cast long, sharp shadows across the snow. At 9 o'clock, Leo heard the engines. It wasn't just Carver's SUV this time. It was a heavy-duty tow truck, its yellow emergency light flashing silently, and the sheriff's cruiser. They parked, and the men got out, their breath misting in the frigid air. Carver looked confident, triumphant. The sheriff looked uncomfortable, like a man doing a job he didn't like. A few other cars had followed, townspeople drawn by the grim spectacle. They stood at a distance, a small, somber audience. Leo was waiting on the steps of the bus. He was not afraid. Tripod sat beside him, silent and still. Agnes's truck was parked a little ways off. She had arrived at dawn, bringing a thermos of coffee and a grim look. "Show them," was all she had said. "Show them all." Carver walked up, his smile thin and sharp. "Time's up, Leo. I'm having this piece of junk hauled to the scrapyard. You can ride with the sheriff." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Son, you need to come with me. We can't have you getting in the way." Leo didn't move. He just looked at Carver. "Before you do that," he said, his voice steady and clear, "there's something you should see. Something everyone should see." From behind the bus, another figure appeared, walking slowly through the snow. It was Dale. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. He had shown up at the bus the night before, a broken man. He had seen the lights in the bus for weeks, eaten alive by his guilt. He had confessed everything to Leo, the whole sordid story of Carver's plan, of the fake fittings, of his own cowardly silence. Leo had listened, and then he had shown Dale the workshop. He had shown him the ledger. Carver's face tightened when he saw Dale. "What is he doing here? He's supposed to be at the yard." Dale didn't look at Carver. He looked at the assembled townspeople, at the sheriff. He was holding the small, leather-bound ledger. "This belonged to Silas," Dale said, his voice shaking but loud enough for all to hear. "It's his real account book." Leo stood up and turned to the bus. He pulled on the handle, and the doors swung open. He walked down the aisle to the back, the sheriff and a curious Carver following. The townspeople surged forward, craning their necks to see. Leo reached the back panel, the one that now swung on its silent hinges. He pulled it down. A collective gasp went through the small crowd as the hidden workshop was revealed, the rows of perfect ships gleaming in the morning light pouring through the windows. Carver stared, his mouth slightly open, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. This wasn't a junked bus. This was something else entirely. Silas was a quiet man, Leo said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. He didn't talk much about what he did, he just did it. Dale stepped forward into the bus, opening the ledger. "He kept a record," Dale said, his voice gaining strength. "A record of all the things he fixed, the things he did for people, for free." He began to read. He read Jed Miller's name, and Jed, a weathered fisherman in the crowd, took off his hat, his face stricken. He read the name of the bakery owner, whose ovens Silas had repaired, taking payment in bread for a month. He read name after name, and with each one, a wave of recognition, of shame, of profound communal memory washed over the faces in the crowd. They were all in that book. Finally, Dale came to the last page. He looked directly at Carver. And he kept a record of the things he protected. He read the entry about the Wanderer, about the antique brass fittings removed for safekeeping. He read the serial numbers aloud, slowly and clearly. Then Leo stepped to the small compartment at the base of the workshop. He turned the key, opened the door, and pulled out the oilcloth bundle. He unwrapped it on the floor. The 8 antique portholes and the heavy binnacle gleamed, their polished brass catching the sun. They were real. They were safe. A dead silence fell over the crowd. The sheriff stared from the fittings on the floor to Carver's suddenly pale face. "Carver," the sheriff said, his voice dangerously quiet, "the insurance report you filed, the fittings you reported stolen, they were recovered from a pawn shop downstate 2 weeks ago. We were investigating the boy here for the theft." Carver was trapped. The fittings he had sold and reported stolen were fakes, copies. The real ones were right here. The serial numbers on the ones in evidence would not match the numbers in Silas's ledger. His whole scheme, built on the assumption that he was dealing with a dead man's junk and a worthless boy, had just collapsed. This is a trick," Carver stammered, but the words had no conviction. He looked at the ships, at the ledger, at the faces of the townspeople, and he saw not admiration or respect, but a cold, gathering judgment. He had tried to crush a legacy, and instead, the legacy had just crushed him. The sheriff took a step toward him. "Mr. Carver," he said.
Okay, we'll put beans in there. Thanks for the likes, Raihan. Appreciate it. Good to see you. Okay. R5, 6, 7. Six, 7, 8. Oh, maybe I did have it right. Huh. Go figure. Do you have class pass? No, Emma, I don't have class pass. But I just have like a membership at a yoga studio and a rock climbing gym. And with as much as I go, it actually ends up being cheaper for me. Ooh, okay, Poochie. Let's see. A little door here. Oh, that looks great. Okay. Clone, you got the spacing right. Okay. Put this honey in there. Oh, we need to put this tree down. Okay. Maybe, hey, can you help me? But they want food. Okay. There you go. it is really cool how they can like speed up growth. Okay, these two over here. Hey. Okay.